Salam from Malaysia. Thank you for joining me in this presentation on English language education in Malaysia, policy and practice. So in this presentation, I look at the multiple and intersecting layers surrounding English language education in multilingual Malaysia. So I will begin with the arrival and increasing use of English during the British colonial period with a focus on English in education. Secondly, I look at the subsequent changes in language and language education policy and their impact on language education in the post-colonial era. Thirdly, I will touch on the colloquial variety of English in Malaysia. I will then discuss how these layers continue to influence language policies, especially English language education policies and practice. Let me begin with when and how English took hold in Malaysia. The use of English in what is now Malaysia can be traced to the British presence in the Malay Peninsula in the 18th century. The influence of English increased with the need for English in the administrative and commercial sectors in the Straits settlements of Penang, Singapore and Malacca, and subsequently British Malaya. English language education was also an important factor in the increasing use and spread of English. So English language education in Malaysia can be traced back to the 19th century with the establishment of English medium schools such as the Penang Free School, Malacca High School, St. Thomas Secondary School in Kuching, St. Mary's School in Kuching. Now at this point, there were at least 4 main mediums of instruction with different curriculums. At the primary school level, you had English, Malay, Chinese, i.e. Mandarin, and Tamil as main mediums of instruction. And at the secondary school level, you had mainly English medium schools, and there were some Chinese medium schools as well. However, upon independence of Malaya in 1957, the Malay language was accorded national language status and was to gradually replace English as the language of public administration as provided for in Article 152 of the Federal Constitution and later the National Language Acts of 1963 and 67. And this was done with the aim of promoting and creating a common national identity. Now, given the country's British colonial history, English, of course, continued to be used, for example, in legislative matters and legal proceedings. It could even be used in Parliament. So there was kind of a grace period for the use of English to be slowly phased out. Subsequently, the National Language Acts, which I mentioned earlier, the National Language Acts of 1963 and 67, declared that Malay was now to be the official language throughout Malaysia, except in the two new states on the island of Borneo, Sabah and Sarawak. Now again, there was still a grace period for the use of English, especially for Sabah and Sarawak. And now this brings me to the next layer, language and language education policies. So as a recap, we start with the British presence in Malaya, and we see the increasing use of English, not just in administration and commerce, but also with the setting up of English medium schools. But by the time we gained independence and formed Malaysia, Malay was taking a stronger foothold, if you like, in public administration as well as the school systems, so that by the early 1970s there was a move to convert all English medium schools into Malay medium schools. So just after independence, we still had 4 mediums of instruction, Malay, Chinese, English and Tamil, but now with a common curriculum. But by the early 70s, English medium schools were phased out, with the conversion fully completed by 1983. So at the primary level, you still have your Tamil, Chinese, Mandarin, medium primary schools, which continue to exist even today. In addition, the status of Malay as the main medium of instruction in all educational institutions, except for the national type schools, i.e. the Chinese and Tamil medium schools, this was further reiterated in the National Education Act of 1996. But English continues to be a compulsory subject up to the 5th form in secondary school in public secondary schools. Now, so we can see that English is still seen as an important second language in the Malaysian education system. But something else has been happening in the Malaysian education system as Malaysia aims towards being an international hub for education, or at least a regional hub for education. There was an increasing a number of private and international schools, and generally in these schools, English is the main medium of instruction. And it's interesting to note that more than half of the students in international schools are actually Malaysians. And these schools are located in urban areas with higher school fees. And so you can imagine that there will be a disparity in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds of the students attending these schools. Another implication of these international schools is that perhaps just as in the past, um, there's now a growing privileged group of English speaking Malaysians who have attended these private or international schools, who may then have an advantage when it comes to job opportunities, for example. It was felt that the English language proficiency of Malaysians was dropping drastically, and something needed to be done about that apart from enhancing English language education. So in 2003, there was a drastic change in the education system when English was introduced in stages at the primary and secondary levels for the teaching of science and maths in public schools. So all this while, from the from the early 70s, you had the changeover from English to Malay as a medium of instruction, and now not completely, but at least for science and mathematics based subjects, we had to now teach these subjects in English. So this is known as the teaching of science and mathematics in English, or the Malay acronym PPSMI. However, due to many factors, which we will not go into today, this policy was actually scrapped in 2012, and everything went back to being taught in Malay. But at the same time, there was a new policy known as the MBI, that is the Malay acronym for upholding the Malay language and strengthening the English language. So again, we see English still coming into play in language policies, because this is the Malaysian education blueprint for. So we have two blueprints, one for schools and one from higher education. So this is the one for schools, and this was a strategic plan to improve education in Malaysia in schools. So in here, one of the strategies was the MBI policy, in a bid to create proficient bilingual speakers. And this initiative, as I said, was part of the Malaysian Education Blueprint for primary and secondary schools 2013-2025 by the Ministry of Education Malaysia. Interestingly, the MEB, Malaysian Education Blueprint, also called for the learning of a third language, and this was echoed in the blueprint for higher education as well. So now we see some elements of multilingualism coming into language policies or language education policies in Malaysia. So to support the Malaysian Education Blueprint policy for the upholding of the Malay language and strengthening the English language, there were two roadmaps, one for English and one for Malay language education, which documents which charts the direction and strategies for both these languages. So for English, we have the English language education reform in Malaysia, the roadmap 2015-2025. So for English, we have the English language education reform in Malaysia, or the roadmap 2015-2025, which basically adopts the Common European Framework of Reference for as a benchmark for English language proficiency at various stages of education, from preschool right up to higher education, and sets out strategies to achieve these benchmarks, including for teacher training, actually, right? And now we have the dual language program introduced in 2016, and again, this was about the use of English, where it allowed schools to choose, if they had the resources, if they had the students and parents who wanted it, to teach English to teach maths and science based subjects as well as ICT subjects in English. And then the rationale behind it was similar to the earlier um, the earlier policy, sorry. And the rationale for this is similar to the earlier policy in 2003 to 2012 of teaching science and maths based subjects in English, i.e., that this would provide more exposure to students and therefore improve their English language proficiency. So it was basically using the medium of instruction as a way to improve English language proficiency. In fact, one state, the Sarawak, actually decided that all primary schools, except for Chinese medium schools, would have to teach science and maths in English from 2020. The other states, it was up to the schools to decide if they wanted to do so. Once again, to recap where we are, we looked at the British presence, we looked at the increasing use of English in commerce, in administration, in English medium schools being set up. Then we saw with independence and with the formation of Malaysia, Malay being given the status of national language and official language. And then we saw the phasing out of English medium schools into Malay medium schools, but still with the Chinese and Tamil schools being allowed, primary schools being allowed to stay on. And then we saw lots of policy changes with an English emphasis, like the teaching of science and math subjects in English, and then the strengthening of English in the Malaysian Education Blueprint, the dual language program, the English language roadmap, using CFR as a benchmark for language proficiency. So you can see that there has been quite a lot of changes in terms of policy where English language education is concerned. And with that, I would like to move on to the next layer, Malaysian Englishes. So this figure of Englishes in Malaysia shows the complex web that constitutes the different levels or sub-varieties of English used in Malaysia. And as you can see, it's really influenced by a host of factors. And I'd like to focus on colloquial Malaysian English, because the English used in Malaysia really comprises many sub-varieties. It's spoken with multitude of accents. It's spoken by people with different levels of proficiency, fluency. It's spoken by people from different social backgrounds, different age groups, educational backgrounds, ethnicity, different home languages or dominant languages. They come from different parts of Malaysia. And the multilingual environment of Malaysia means that most Malaysians are at least bilingual, if not multilingual. And so within this context, English really could be a first for a minority of Malaysians, second or other language. And I think this needs to be kept in mind when we talk about English language education. Going back to the colloquial variety of Malaysian English, it really is used for intra-national communication between Malaysians of varying ethnicity as a medium of local communication. These are my emphasis, but I'm quoting Gill 2002 in talking about the role or the use of the colloquial variety of English. And Schneider also mentions that the more colloquial variety of English is really a carrier of a distinctly Malaysian identity. The Malaysian variety of English can also be seen as a versatile variety that is viable for effective communication. So the colloquial variety of English should not be seen as a distortion of the English language, because it is just one sub-variety of English. I think the point is whether people have different sub-varieties in their language repertoire, whether you're able to use a more standard form in a context that requires it, and when you can use the colloquial variety for effective communication among fellow Malaysians, to mark your identity, to mark solidarity among Malaysians. Now in this extract, we see a distinction being made between the presumably non-standard way of speaking English by Malaysians and the need for a more standard form of spoken English for international communication. And while context is definitely important in our choice of varieties, however, in terms of pronunciation, I think this needs to be discussed a little further, but we won't go into that today. In this presentation, I looked at the arrival and spread of English in Malaysia during the British colonial times, and also a upon independence and after, and I also showed you some of the key language and language education policies, especially those pertaining to English language education. I also showed you a snapshot of Malaysian Englishes. I would like to look at three intersecting elements. The first is the legacies of the past which influence attitudes and perceptions language, about language learning, about language education, acceptability, standards, what's prestigious, what's not prestigious. And a lot of times at least in Malaysia, we seem to be wanting to go back to what is considered or what are considered to be glory days, the good old days when everyone spoke good English and English medium schools were thought to be the way, the best, or the way to better English. And these have had an impact on the layer of policies and practices, especially where English language education is concerned. And we see that with the bringing back of English as a medium of instruction to teach science and math, and then of going back to not using English and then allowing a choice under the dual language program of offering these subjects in English again. Now, of course, there are also other factors like the current social situation, the current political climate of the country, which does also influence policies and practices. And intersecting these two layers, we have another layer, the colloquial varieties, the sub-varieties of Malaysian English, the actual language used in the country, and how the Malaysian variety of English is developing and it's being used in innovative and creative ways. It's being used to communicate with each other, not just orally. It's used on social media, it's used on many other platforms. And this use actually also influences public perceptions, attitudes, our sense of identity, but it also gives rise to negative attitudes brought on by people who feel that everyone should just be speaking one standard variety of English. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that it's difficult to run away from the past. So where we are right now is we are navigating the past, the present, and the future. The past determined in a way that English was our other language, not French, not Italian, not German, but English. The past also saw changes in language policies. For example, Malay being the national language, the official language. The past also saw changes in the education policy, common curriculum, allowing for different mediums of instruction at the primary level, but Malay as the main medium of instruction in national schools at the primary and secondary level. In fact, the only medium of instruction in public schools at the secondary level is Malay up to today. But we also saw changes in policies with English at the center of them all, such as the teaching of science and math in English, the dual language program, and then later we saw the roadmap, which is still charting like the future direction of English language education in the country. At the same time that all this was happening, a local variety of English was also developing. And within all of this, we have to remember the multilingual context of Malaysia. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Have a nice day. You can email me if you have any questions.